All right. So lately we've been really digging deep into this whole fairness thing
Yeah.
and pre-employment testing, all those accusations of bias flying around.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I've got a ton of research on this, but there's this one study that really stood out.
Uh-huh.
This paper by Aguinas,
Okay.
Culpepper, and Pierce.
Yeah.
And
Like
actually,
Wiener's like the beer.
it's Aguinas like the beer. I,
Yes.
I always want to say it the other way.
No. It's tough.
But yeah, so this study really kind of flips the script on how we think about bias in these tests.
It does. For decades, researchers have been using all these different tools and methods to try and detect bias in tests, especially those tests, the ones focused on general mental ability.
Right, GMA.
GMA, exactly.
Yeah.
But what Aguinas and his colleagues are suggesting is that those very tools that we're using to find bias might actually be part of the problem.
Wait, so you're saying our bias detectors are like bias themselves?
That's exactly it. It's like a bit of a paradox, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to find bias, but the tools you're using might be bias themselves. So it's a tricky situation.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit.
Sure.
When we talk about bias in these tests, what exactly are we looking for?
So there are two main types of bias that we typically look for. The first one is called intercept bias. So imagine you have two people from different groups taking the same test,
Okay,
and they get the same score.
got it.
But if the test systematically overpredicts or underpredicts the job performance of one person simply because of the group they belong to, that's what we call intercept bias.
So it's not really a fair comparison then. They're not starting on a level playing field.
Exactly. It's like starting a race where one person has a head start and the other has a handicap.
Makes sense. Okay, what about the second type of bias?
All right. The second type is called slope bias. This one's a bit more subtle. So in this case, the relationship between the test score and actual job performance is different for different groups.
So it's like the test is more accurate or predictive for some people than it is for others.
You got it. It's almost like using a measuring stick that changes length depending on who you're measuring. It's not a consistent measure across the board.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I remember reading that for years, researchers thought that this slope bias was pretty rare.
Yeah, that was the prevailing wisdom for a long time. Most studies found that when bias did show up, it was mostly this intercept bias, and often in a way that seemed to favor minority groups.
So it seems like good news in a way, right?
On the surface, it did. But Aguinas and his team, they decided to dig a little deeper.
And what did they find when they started digging? Was there more slope bias hiding in these tests than we thought?
That's the interesting part. They found a pretty clever way to investigate this. They created this massive simulation, basically running millions of different scenarios with different sample sizes, different test reliability levels, all sorts of variations.
Millions of scenarios. That's a lot of data.
It is. It was a huge undertaking. And through all these simulations, they discovered something pretty shocking. The traditional methods that we've been using to detect bias, they often miss the mark, especially when it comes to slope bias.
Really? So we could be missing the slope bias even when it's right there in front of us.
Exactly. It's like trying to find a tiny crack in a wall using a blurry magnifying glass. You might miss it completely.
Okay. So we might be missing the slope bias, but what about that intercept bias we talked about earlier, the one that seemed to favor minority groups? What did Aguades and his team have to say about that?
Well, that's where their second big finding comes in. They suggest that this finding of intercept bias favoring minorities might actually be a statistical mirage.
A mirage. What do you mean by that?
It's like an illusion created by flaws in how we collect and analyze data. Things like small sample sizes, measurement errors, and what's called range restriction, where the sample doesn't really represent the full range of scores. All these things can skew the results and make it look like there's bias when there might not be.
So it's not that there isn't any real bias. It's just that the way we're measuring it might be giving us a distorted picture.
Precisely. It's a bit like looking at a bent spoon in a glass of water. It looks broken, but it's just the way the light is refracting.
Wow, that's a real game changer. So we might not be seeing true bias. It's just a trick of the data.
Exactly. And that throws a real wrench into how we understand fairness in these tests. Not just for organizations who are using them, but also for the individuals who are being tested.
Right, this isn't just some abstract statistical debate.
Yeah.
This has real implications for people's lives and their opportunities.
Absolutely.
Okay, so before we dive into those implications, I want to make sure I've got this straight. The researchers are basically saying that the tools we've been using to detect bias might actually be creating this illusion of fairness and potentially masking instances of real bias, especially this slope bias. Did I get that right?
You got it. That's a great summary. They're basically saying we need to be much more critical of how we're measuring and interpreting bias in these tests. And they also propose some solutions like using larger sample sizes and being more careful about accounting for those statistical quirks that can mislead us.
So it's not just about identifying bias, but also about making sure we're not creating false positives or missing real instances of bias because of our methods.
Exactly. It's about getting a clearer, more accurate picture of what's really going on.
This is fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
So what does all this mean for the real world? Why should our listeners care about all these statistical deep dives? How does this actually play out in the workplace and in people's lives?
Yeah.
Let's unpack that in part 2.
Let's do it. Well, for organizations, relying on these tests, that could be bias that can lead to some pretty serious consequences.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
You could end up, hiring the wrong people.
Yeah.
You could miss out on some really talented candidates.
Uh-huh.
And you could even face legal challenges if your hiring practices are seen as discriminatory.
Yeah. And it's not just about the organizations, though, right?
No, not at all.
I mean, for individuals, this isn't just about abstract statistics.
Right.
This is about real opportunities.
Absolutely. It is. It's about people's lives.
Yeah.
Imagine being denied a job or a promotion
Yeah.
because a test underestimated your true potential. And it wasn't because of your actual abilities. It was because of your race or your gender.
Definitely like that.
Yeah, or some other group affiliation. I mean, that's just not fair.
No, it's not. It's about fairness and equal access to opportunity.
Exactly.
And that makes the reasons behind those group differences in test scores even more important to understand.
Yeah, for sure.
We touched on this a bit earlier,
Uh-huh.
but what are some of the factors that might contribute to these score gaps in the first place?
There are a few things to consider, and they often work together,
Okay.
One area to think about is the socio-historical and cultural context.
Yeah.
So things like unequal access to quality education, economic disparities, even cultural differences in how we approach testing situations.
Interesting.
All of these things can play a role.
So if someone hasn't had the same opportunities to learn and prepare,
Yeah.
they're not going to perform as well on a test, even if they have the same underlying abilities.
Exactly. And that's a huge problem.
Yeah, it is. And then there's the whole social psychological dimension too, right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Like stereotype threat.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that if you're aware of a negative stereotype about your group, that awareness can actually interfere with your performance,
Absolutely.
even if you don't believe the stereotype yourself.
Yeah, it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Yeah, I've definitely felt that pressure before.
Yeah, it's real, and it's been studied extensively, and the research shows that it can have a significant impact on test scores, especially for groups that are often stereotyped as being less capable in certain areas.
Yeah, like women in STEM fields, for example.
Yeah.
So even if the test itself is technically sound, all these external factors, these disadvantages, these pressures,
Yeah.
they can lead to real disparities that don't reflect actual ability.
That's the key point. You could have a test that's perfectly valid and reliable,
right.
but if the people taking it are coming from different backgrounds with different experiences, and they're facing different levels of pressure and anxiety, then the results are not going to be a fair reflection of their true ability.
It's not a level playing field.
Exactly. And this is where the Ogrenny study really challenges us.
Okay.
It's not enough to just look for those simple intercept and slope differences. We need a much more nuanced approach. We need to look beyond just the numbers on the test and consider the broader context, all those factors that might be contributing to group differences.
So let's recap for our listener. What are the key takeaways you think they should keep in mind when thinking about the fairness of testing,
Okay, so
especially in the context of employment?
I think the most important thing is to be aware of the complexity of this issue.
Yeah.
We can't just assume a test is fair because it appears to be unbiased on the surface.
Right.
We need to dig deeper. Think about the potential for both intercept and slope bias. And remember those statistical mirages that Aguinis and his team uncovered.
Yeah, don't be fooled by appearances.
Exactly.
And don't forget about those real-world factors that can influence scores.
Right.
Things like socioeconomic background, cultural differences,
Yeah.
stereotype threat. All of these things can create disparities that don't reflect true ability.
Absolutely. We have to remember that testing is about more than just numbers. It's about people's lives and their opportunities.
Well said. But how do we make sure those tests are actually fair and equitable? Are there concrete steps that organizations can take? Let's explore some solutions and real-world examples in our final part. Okay, so we've talked about how tricky it can be to spot bias in these tests. But we also know that it can have some pretty huge consequences. So what can we actually do about it? Are there ways to make these tests fairer?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the first step is really recognizing that making tests fair, it's not a one-time thing.
Right.
It's an ongoing process. We need to be constantly reviewing and evaluating our assessment tools,
Okay.
looking for potential sources of bias. And that could be in the questions themselves, the way the test is administered, even the scoring system. You got to look at everything.
It's like you're constantly doing a system check for fairness.
Exactly.
But sometimes bias can be so ingrained that it's hard to spot, even when you're looking for it. Like I'm thinking about those real-world cases of testing bias that have made the news, like that lawsuit against the fire department,
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
where their physical fitness test was found to be unfairly screening out women.
That's a great example. And it really highlights how even seemingly objective measures can perpetuate these hidden biases.
It wasn't intentionally designed to discriminate, but the standards they were using ended up creating a significant barrier for female applicants.
Right. And it turned out those women were just as capable of performing the job.
Exactly. They
Yeah.
just weren't being given a fair chance to prove it.
Exactly.
So what are some concrete steps that organizations can take to make their tests more equitable? Are there any practical solutions out there?
Well, Aquinas, Culpepper, and Pierce, they actually offer some pretty solid solutions in their paper.
Okay.
First, they emphasize the importance of using larger sample sizes when evaluating tests.
Right. We talked about those statistical mirages earlier.
Exactly. Larger samples help to reduce the chances of getting those misleading results.
So bigger is better when it comes to data.
Pretty much.
Makes sense.
They also talk about the importance of controlling for all those factors that can skew the results, things like measurement error and range restriction.
Right. Those pesky little details that can really mess things up.
Exactly. It's like fine-tuning your microscope to get a clearer, more accurate picture.
And I imagine as we develop even more sophisticated statistical techniques, we'll get even better at identifying and mitigating these biases.
Oh, absolutely. This field is constantly evolving.
Yep.
There are always new tools and approaches being developed.
It's exciting.
It is.
Yeah.
The key is to stay informed, be willing to adapt, and never stop questioning our assumptions.
That's a great point. It feels like we've only just scratched the surface of this really complex topic.
Yeah, we have.
But Aquinas and his colleagues have definitely given us a lot to think about. So as we wrap up here, what's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with from this deep dive?
I think the most important message is that achieving fairness in testing, it's not a destination, it's a journey.
I like that.
We need to be constantly questioning our methods, examining our assumptions, and striving to create assessments that are truly equitable and unbiased.
Beautifully put. Bias can be really tricky to spot, especially when it's hiding in plain sight. But with the right tools and a commitment to fairness, we can create a more level playing field for everyone. Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into the world of testing and bias. We'll see you next time for another thought-provoking exploration.